Welcome in this seminar on precarious work and social security. I'm Paul Schoukens. I'm teaching social security law at the University of Leuven and also at the University of Tilburg, and I mainly work in the field of comparative and European social security law, specializing in atypical work forms. So today we are going to address the challenges which are being dealt with when dealing with precarious work and the access, mainly the access to social protection. I will be touching upon other issues like financing, but the main emphasis will be accessing social protection and what are the challenges for working people in precarious situations. Now, the first thing I would like to do today is to say something about the concept of precarious work, because it's a very general concept and we may have very different meanings by that, but I would like to develop a working definition for this seminar today. And then I will shift into the main area of today, that's access to social security. If we're working in a precarious way, what does it mean for the protection of your social security? And probably it won't surprise you, but I will build much of my talk around the recent EU recommendation dealing with this subject and translating the pillar of social rights. Yet, I will also go beyond it, so a large part will be on the recommendation. I will also explain what the basis is, the pillar, the objective of the recommendation, whom it is addressing, and then I will look at access in its various components and dimensions, formal, effective access, adequate access, and transparent access. But then in the last part I would like to go beyond that recommendation and take out a very challenging group of, often precarious workers, and those are platform workers. They do challenge our systems in quite different ways and various ways, and that problem goes a little bit beyond the European Union setting. And in the last part I would like to say something beyond the access. It would focus upon the financing. Now, if you look at the European Union and if you look at the objectives and recommendations, it focuses strongly, not only, but strongly upon the benefit side. And I would like to say something upon maybe Europe should also, or can do something on the financing side of social security. And then we have some conclusions and outlook. But first, precarious work. What is precarious work? I think if you look at the concept of precarious workers, very often it's combined or it's being explained with similar concepts like work in poverty, like marginal work, like non-standard work, and work without access to social security. And somewhere we have to make a definition for today what precarious work can be. Now, working in poverty, it can be, of course, be precarious work. It's about people who work, sometimes even in full-time occupations, but their earnings are very marginal, are very low, and they're even below the poverty line, which is then being defined in the European Union context of 60% of the median equalized income. Which is weird, because normally work is the access to a decent standard of living, work is the access to social protection. Traditionally, if people worked, normally there was no issue of poverty or precariousness. At least when they worked full-time, and at least when they were working for an employer, and at least when they had an indefinite work period, so dealing with the non-standard work. But we have more and more people working, but they don't earn enough. And they stay below the poverty line. And this is, of course, a major subject now in the European Union. And it's, of course, also dealing with precarious work, but that will not be our main emphasis. Marginal work is something else. It's about people who work a very little amount. Some hours a week, some days a month. And because of that, their earnings, they stay very marginal, are very below thresholds. Thresholds our social security systems very often use. And they don't reach a threshold, so they are not into the system. It's about the minor jobs, it's about the mini jobs, and very often those people do some activities. Sometimes they combine little activities for several commissioners, for several employers, but they never reach a threshold to be taken into account for social protection. That's very often under the concept of marginal work. It's so marginal that in the end of the day, we don't consider that to be work anymore, and hence those people drop out from social protection or from European rules because they're, strictly speaking, no workers anymore. Non-standard work is also a concept which is very much known. And that's about people working in a non-standard fashion. So you have the standard and you have the non-standard. And the standard are the people traditionally working full-time for an indefinite time period under subordination of an employer. And those people traditionally, they got labor law protection, and they were the first ones very often with decent social protection. If you're away from that standard because you only work part-time, or you only work for, let's say, 1 month, so defined periods, and then sometimes you have work, sometimes you don't have work, or 0 hours contract, or you work on a freelance basis, you're working in a non-standard way. And non-standard meaning that very often our social protection systems were not designed for those non-standard workers, and all kinds of loopholes start to take place. This is also very much debated now. And then this last one is all kinds of work without having a comprehensive, full access to social security. And this is a definition I would like today. It's about people working, but for one or another reason, they are not fully protected by social protection. They are not protected at all, or they're not fully protected. And of course, I'm very much aware that this kind of definition of precarious work, there's all kinds of interlinkage with those other concepts. Very often they are also marginal workers. And very often they are also working in poverty. But I would like to focus very much upon this one, for the access to social protection. Their work is not linked enough, well enough. Sometimes there is a link, sometimes they have some protection, but not well enough. And because of that, they are in a precarious situation. So I assume that the access, the full access to social protection keeps people out of precariousness because they get a serious good income security. When they have that access to social security, either they have good income security of the work, and if that is being lost, they have good income security from social security. Income security and cost compensation coverage for healthcare and so on. So you see there is a very strong link here with social security I'm making. Precarious is the link to social security. If you work and you have a good link with social security, it's not precarious, and it is precarious if that link is being absent. And I do know, of course, that sometimes people, although they have a link to social security, still are poor, but I assume that that link is a kind of safeguard against precariousness. And then, of course, we come very closely what recently has been launched by the EU in that recommendation in November 2019, where they call for a good access to social protection for all workers and all self-employed. So the ones working standard and non-standard way, but also the self-employed. And it will not surprise you that to some extent I will go through that recommendation and share with you some of the practices we notice also in some member states to deal with people who work on a very, well, non-standard way, but still have good protection in the end of the day. I have to tell or to go through some concepts like social security. I focus upon social security today, the access to social security. Now you can have all kinds of definitions, but I will do it in a way we traditionally do in an international setting. I will go through the risks. So what is social security? Well, it's about a set of schemes, public schemes very often, providing persons who face a social risk protection. They give protection to people who face a social risk. Why? Because they lose income or they face major costs. For instance, when you're unemployed or temporarily unemployed, now in Corona, you lose income, we protect. Or when you have to go to the doctor, you have major costs, we address those costs. This on the basis of solidarity. So there is redistribution. The strong shoulders support the weak shoulders. That means there is horizontal, the group protection. I'm not victim of a risk and I support the victim of the risk. I'm supporting my parents, for instance. I support my parents for old age, for instance. So that's the horizontal group. There is also vertical. Those have higher income pay more. Those have lower income pay less. That's a vertical redistribution. But the core of the definition is in the risks. And here you will see I will use the standard list of risks. Income replacement is referring to the protection against old age, survivorship, sickness, invalidity, unemployment, major cost compensation, healthcare, care, family burden, and then you have social assistance, of course, keeping people out of poverty. Traditionally, it's done through public schemes. Sometimes it's done through private schemes, but then there is regulation around those private schemes that there cannot be risk selection, for instance. Like you see in the Netherlands, there is an obligation to that you take out a private healthcare insurance, but there's a lot of regulation around it so that people with no means can have a support to buy out that private insurance and no risk selection. So I know that's not always easy, that public-private, but there's always a public regulation around it. And you have that distinction between insurance and assistance. In Social Security, where assistance, that's always means tested. So we only provide benefits when you really are without means, so only an old age pension when you really have no other means. Whereas in social insurance, traditionally there is no means test. You get a pension because you contributed so many years to the scheme. Yeah, that's a bit in a nutshell. But I think I don't say many new things here and that most of you are very familiar with that. Very shortly, when we're talking about access to Social Security schemes traditionally are being designed around the type of beverage, the type of Bismarck. Bismarck very much work-focused. It are the working people, the professionally active people who are socially protected. Through income-related benefits, so the pension is designed in relation to the previously earned income. It is run by the social partners and controlled by the state, hence a management which is tripartite. And it's financed through contributions, earmarked taxes. So from the wages we levy employer-employee contribution, from the self-employed income we levy contributions. There is also another stream of protection, which is more the beverage, the more Atlantic approach, which found its origins in the UK and then expanded to overseas, but also within Europe, of course. It influenced very strongly, for instance, the Netherlands in the 1960s. Before they then moved on with more private and more social partnerships and so on. But then also the Anglo-Saxon, New Zealand, Australia, Canada and so on have that type beverage very much present, which is much more focused upon the residents. You're protected because you reside in the country. Flat rate benefits, so not income related. The benefits are traditionally the same. Run by the state and financed by taxes, by the budget. But you know that in reality, of course, very often we have the mix of the two. That's in those, the Scandinavian systems are the best examples. First pillar universal, second pillar professional, and then possibly even a third pillar occupational. What you sometimes hear is that this kind of scheme, the beverage kind of scheme, that's maybe the best one for people with low income. So non-standard work or people in precarious work, because it's residence-based, your kind of work does not matter. You're residing in the country, hence you're protected. Whether you're a standard worker, whether you're a freelancer, whether you're a part-time worker, it doesn't matter. You're a resident and hence you get that flat rate benefit. So it's maybe the best approach against precarious work and non-standard work forms. Yes, possibly, but there as well, there are some issues already from the financing side. The system should also be financed, and precarious work can also be a challenge for financing. So if you have many precarious workers in a universal scheme, not much financing will come in, and you will have an issue with your flat rate benefits. Secondly, most of the systems also have a second layer here. And then from the occupational part, they also protect unemployment and work accidents and sickness. There as well, those challenges of that precarious work pop up. So from, let's say, a very macro perspective, it has potentiality to have a much more easy approach to non-precarious workers, but to precarious workers. But if you have many of them, that will be a challenge too for those beverage kinds of schemes. So maybe later on we come back to that. Okay, so then let us move on to the EU. Why the EU? Because recently they give a lot of attention to that access to social protection, and especially to the non-standard workers and the self-employed. And it happens that many of the people working in precarious situations, not having enough social protection, are non-standard workers or self-employed. Recently, in November 2019, the recommendation finds its surroundings in the European Pillar of Social Rights, and that was being launched in April 2017. Which was based upon a recommendation from the Commission and a joint declaration of the Council, Parliament and the Commission. And the idea, I will say it very shortly here, I don't have the time to expand too much on it, but the idea was to build a larger social framework in the EU decision-making. After the crisis of 2010, the approach of the EU towards the national states and their budgets in the monitoring in the semester system was well, a bit unilaterally too financial, too economic. And pensions were being addressed as a cost, not as a merit, not in the way of protecting people. So if you look at the recommendations the EU was giving to the member states was to make sure that pensions should not become too costly, make your people work them longer, maybe you have to cut your benefits. And somewhere the EU felt that the social dimension was missing, and hence that pillar was being launched as a kind of counterpart to make sure that also other elements, when talking about pensions and healthcare, were being addressed, that pensions should be decent, that they should be adequate. Of course, you also have to look at the budget, but you also have to look at the redistribution and adequacy. So that pillar was being launched in 2017 as a kind of counterbalance of a too unilateral economic financial approach towards social security, saying that we should respect the existing social objectives in the EU, but also to the other instruments from the ILO, the UN, the Council of Europe Code of Social Security. So the social acquis globally should be respected and should be incorporated in that pillar. It's not a legal instrument. It is more of a proclamation. It's not enforceable. You cannot go to a court and ask for the protection of your right to unemployment on the basis of the pillars. No, it's a kind of framework. It's a kind of surrounding which the EU, when making a new recommendation or a new rule or a new regulation or by member states, they have to check whether they are fitting within that pillar. For instance, the recommendation on access to social protection, if you change your pension scheme, you should also pay attention, what about non-standard work, part-time work, freelancers, do they still have enough access? Member states remain competent in social security, and there is some relation with the right to social protection, Article 34. It's not so clear. This is more legal, this is less legal, but it's more a policy document. Having listed 12 fundamental social principles or rights, some on access to labour market and work conditions, and then some on social protection and social inclusion. And one of them I will single it out. It is the access to social protection. So one of the principles is dealing with access to social protection. It's principle 12. And actually it's saying regardless of the type and duration of their employment relationship, so whether you're part-time working, full-time working, working on the basis of a defined labour contract, all workers and all self-employed under comparable conditions, I will come back to that later, they should have right to social protection, adequate social protection. And this should help also to combat precarious situations. So if you're working in a non-typical standard situation, it should safeguard those people to have nevertheless access to social protection in an adequate way, whatever adequate can mean. I will come back to that later. Now this looks a bit very complicated, but what I think is interesting in this recommendation, and in a way it reflects a little bit my own research in the past, it's not saying that everybody should have exactly the same protection. It is saying everybody should have comparable protection. So the basic principles should be the same. It's labor form neutral. When you lose your job as a wage earner, you lose income, and that income should be protected. When a self-employed business is stopping its business, for instance because of COVID-19, you're losing your income, and that income should be protected. But the way of organizing that income protection should be specific to the labor form. For the wage earner, we look at the relation with the employer and how the wage earner has been made redundant, how he has been or she has been fired. For the self-employed, we look at the stopping of the business. He or she does not have an employer. So the same basic principles, but the way of organizing your protection may be different. So that's comparable conditions. And this recommendation reflects very well that way of looking at social protection. So the main ambition is all working people, standard, non-standard, and all self-employed should have access to an equal social protection in the end of the day. The way you design it can be adapted to the concrete working situations of the non-standard worker, the platform worker, the self-employed. And it's finding that balance. And that's something you see, and I put here some references very often coming back in the recommendation, but also in the principle of the European pillar. The comparable protection, you can tailor the rules to the situation of the specific group. And by approaching in that way, I think you open up quite some possibility for non-standard workers and self-employed also to enjoy protection. It is possible to organize unemployment schemes for self-employed. It is possible to organize temporary unemployment. We see it with Corona now, to organize temporary unemployment. But pay attention to their specific way of working. And also for the financing, this will be very important because income of a self-employed is not the same as income of a worker. Now, who are the non-standard workers and that's very often precarious workers? This comes from Eurostat 2018. The majority, it's dropped here, are still the standard workers, meaning full-time workers, workers on the basis of an indefinite time contract, working in subordination. And then the remaining 40%, grossly said, are all types of non-standard workers and self-employed. Self-employed with employees and self-employed without employees and with employees. It's 14% together. Overall, the number of self-employed in the European Union stayed stable the last 20-25 years, but has been a shift from self-employed with employees to self-employed without employees. This group has been growing, and this group went down. So the solo self-employed, like in the UK, in the Netherlands, the last couple of years pushed even that group a little bit. The traditional self-employed business person with some employees has been reduced. And then you have employees part-time permanent, so they are having a permanent labor contract, but they are part-time. Very often that's on a voluntary basis because they want so. Not all, but you have to be paying attention. Some people, they enjoy to work part-time because they can combine it better with their private life. So that's not necessarily negatively. Of course, it will have effect on social protection. Some, of course, it has been imposed upon them, and that's less good, of course. Then you have full-time people. They work full-time, but only temporary, for 1 month, 2 months, and so on. And then you have a growing part. It's about, especially in flex work, people working and part-time and temporary, and they are very, in a very weak position very often because they don't have full-time work. Their income is low, and it's never sure. They work for some weeks, some days, then it stops and they have to find another occupation. So that's a bit, so employees full-time, what should have been here, it has been apparently, went over here. It's still the majority, it even has been growing a little bit the last couple of years. But these are the non-standard workers, and very often we find here the precarious workers because they don't have enough social protection. Self-employed, they are not standard because they do not work in dependency or in subordination. So very often they are deviating from their own masters, if you can say so. And that can create problems for creating an unemployment scheme, because unemployment is very much reflecting the subordination with your employer. It's because your employer made you redundant that you lose income. But if you're not working in personal subordination, you're self-employed, and then an unemployment scheme becomes a bit more difficult. They are not economically depending, strictly speaking, because they have many clients. If you lose one client, a pity, but you have enough other clients to raise your income. Unless you're a self-employed with 1 or 2 clients, and then you come very close, of course, to the wage earners. And you're a weak self-employed or you're depending self-employed. Part-time work and temporary work is more upon the labor stability. If you work with a full-time contract for an indefinite duration, you're pretty safe. You're almost kind of civil servant. You know that for the future you're safe. It's stable. And those people, normally, they consume more, and for them, good income security is very often made because you know you have a very stable relation with your employer. Part-time temporary is deviating from that, and then, of course, the stability is not so strong in income and duration, and hence this is creating challenges for organizing social protection. Some examples. Here you see some types of non-standard work and precarious workers and the challenges this is creating for social protection. Normally a standard worker, he earns a salary. What do you see with non-standard worker and self-employed? A self-employed does not earn a salary, he's earning or she's earning an income, and that income can be very volatile. You see more and more atypical work forms like volunteers, for instance, like people who are working in an apprenticeship and so on, who do not earn an income. How to protect them? Because the income earning is the basis. Informal work, of course, so those types, they're creating problems for social protection because social protection is very often designed around the standard salary. If I earn every month so much money, on that I pay contributions, that is the basis for the calculation for my unemployment. But if that basis is very volatile or very limited or very low, it's creating problems here for your non-standard work. To say it in the other way around, persons not in work need to find work. If you're unemployed, we try to bring you back to the labor market. But if we find a job as unpaid work, as marginal work, is that as good then? If we push you in non-standard work, is that fine for the unemployment scheme? Question mark. So this is creating problems. So sometimes people, they find a new job on a platform, for instance, as an Uber driver, but they earn very part-time and a very basic income. Is that enough, decent enough to be considered to be, well, for the unemployment scheme, to leave the unemployment scheme? Question mark. Standard work normally works with employers. They're very important for the financing, paying the contributions. They're very important for conditioning, for instance, unemployment schemes or sicknesses. Many non-standard or precarious workers, they work for multiple employers. Agency work, platform work. They have many commissioners, many employers. Who is then the employer? Or they have an employer overseas, in China, in the US, on a platform. And then we have more and more self-employed who are bogus self-employed. They are in reality wage earner, but formally self-employed. How then to design the employer-based social protection for those people? Because they're self-employed, officially they don't have an employer, but in reality they have. But how then to design that? And this is, I think, this is all technical more. This is more as to the income level. Very often our social protection schemes have thresholds, minimum levels of income, which you should earn to enter the scheme. What do you do then with if your income is very low, if you have very small numbers of hours, low income, or when it's very difficult to track hours? With COVID-19 now we have been shifting to homework. How many hours do we work? Question mark. This is also creating the access problems with the access to social protection. Good. Now back to the recommendation of November 2019. Something on the scope, first the personal scope, material scope, and then we'll go to the elements of access. Whom is it addressing? Well, it's addressing all professionally active, all workers, standard and non-standard, and all self-employed, all. So even if it's very marginal work, it's being addressed in the recommendation. And so the non-standard workers, a person working in the framework of an employment relationship with an employer, but the contracts depart from the standards. They are part-time or they're definite in time. Self-employed, all persons who work on their own behalf, although it's not literally defined, that's what it means in the recommendation. Strangely enough, I will not give it too much attention, is the material scope. Social protection is defined by listing traditional risks, as the one I listed before, but not family benefits. That's strange, but it has to do that it's covered somewhere else in the pillar. And not social assistance and minimum income schemes. You can say it's mainly social insurance addressing. So in that way, it's a bit more narrow than social security as we know. The recommendation is calling for access. And that's something, I mean, they have been splitting up the different dimensions of access. Normally, access was unilateral, but they try to give it more dimensions. And non-standard work is very often creating problems in some of those dimensions. So they had to unravel it in different layers, dimensions of access. They make a distinction between formal access and effective access. This is very much the personal scope. I belong to the personal scope of the scheme, hence I'm protected. This is much more about entitlement conditions. I'm long enough in that scope to have benefits. This is about the level, and this is about keeping the system simple, transparency, and information. And they approach those different elements. Because not everything is solved simply with formal access. It's not by giving you access to the scheme that your access will be effective or of a good level. So you need those different dimensions when talking about the relation of work and social security. First, formal access. That's in Article 8. And there the recommendation is asked to improve the formal coverage for all workers. And to give you, regardless of the type of employment, whether you're part-time or full-time, all workers should have access. Meaning also the part-time, the one with defined work, the marginal work, they should have access to old age, to all the risks and all the contingencies which have been mentioned, also unemployment, which may challenge some of the countries because they have been pushing out some workers, part-time or marginal workers, from protection, or only give voluntary protection. Self-employed the same, at least on a voluntary basis, where appropriate on a mandatory basis. I'll come back to that later. So there is more flexibility, but still it's asked to do it mandatory. Unless you cannot do, then you can do it voluntarily. Now this is not something for me. I took it from some of the colleagues from Slavina Spasova and others who have been designing, who have been mapping the access to social protection. Here it's about the self-employed, here it's about the non-standard workers, and red it's not covered, and yellow it's only voluntarily covered, and blue it's mandatory covered. Look at unemployment. It's self-employed and unemployment, much red, much yellow. It is a different contingency for the self-employed. Sickness benefits, it's a bit comparable. There is still red and there is still some yellow because sickness and self-employment is also tricky. If you look at non-standard workers, there the issue is slightly, in a way, better. We take unemployment and old age. Unemployment and non-standard work, much red. And old age and non-standard work, like part-time work and so on, much yellow and red. This has to do with other reasons. This has to do because those people do not earn enough, and because they don't earn enough, they bump into the thresholds and cannot enter the schemes. Very often, only on a voluntary basis sometimes, but then they don't take it up. Here, it's not so much to do with income levels a priori, it more has to do with it is difficult to organize unemployment for self-employment. It's not an easy thing. So most of the countries say, well, it's too complicated, we don't start with it. Yet, the Commission is asking to invest there to that access. Here you see it's simply the countries, the abbreviations, and it's coming back again. Unemployment, sickness and accidents at work, much voluntarily or not available. And this is showing that for the self-employed, it's at the gaps of the self-employed in 2019, it is showing either not available or voluntarily, and it's mainly those risks because it's very hard for the self-employed to have them organized. Here I would like to ask your attention a little bit. In the report from Slavina Spasova on self-employment and social protection, you will see a typology coming up, inclusive systems with mandatory protection for all the contingencies. Access à la carte, saying that sometimes voluntarily, sometimes mandatory, and voluntarily that's your own decision then as a self-employed, and then this is exclusive, no full access to social protection. And then Slavina has been putting countries for risks under them, under those three types for the self-employed. It's a good way of mapping it, but you have to pay attention because what does it say as to the protection level? It's possible that you have access to all the risks for all the contingencies as a self-employed, but the level of your protection is very weak. It's not adequate. So be careful. I mean, this is not saying this is always the best. This is simply inclusive as to access, but still there can be a question what to do with the level of your benefits or the adaptability of your benefits to the way of organizing your self-employment. I myself, I had another approach. It was universal protection, so you cover everybody or all working people. A system covering all the self-employed, and then systems covering types of self-employed in groups. And very often I found that universal or general systems are not always the best, although they are very inclusive. Their levels of protection were not always good, or they were not taking enough into account the self-employed activity which is specific. Whereas in categorical schemes, they had the advantage that the scheme was focusing much more upon the own way of organizing the work activity as a self-employed. So an employment benefit was nicely in line with the way of organizing you as a self-employed. But they had a disadvantage that some of the groups were left out because they did not belong to the nice categories of the self-employed who were protected. So what is in a name? What is in a typology? Typologies are interesting to structure, of course, material, but they also have some shortcomings. So what are, to come to a kind of summary when we talk about formal access, so we have been seeing some gaps And for the self-employed, this is mainly due to the fact that some of the contingencies are very difficult to organize. When do we know that the self-employed did not organize his or her own unemployment? Question mark. It's not easy. What is the income loss with sickness? If a self-employed is 1 month sick, will he or she lose really income if you look for a full year? And that's what we are having now with Corona too. Some self-employed probably lost some income because of unemployment or sickness. But maybe after 1, 2, 3 months, they recover the income because they could reorganize their work, or they found new ways of organizing their work. They went from a restaurant to takeaway and so on. So maybe over 1 year time, the revenues are still the same compared to last year. So it's very difficult to assess the loss of income. The same for accidents at work, which is very much related to employers. So these are the traditional difficult risks for self-employed, and hence you will find many gaps because states don't want to invest here. You have to rethink your social protection. But the recommendation is asking for doing that, and there are examples. Here with the non-standard work, the part-time workers, it's much more with income thresholds. They earn not enough, marginal or solo self-employed or part-time workers, and hence they're bumping into those thresholds. So it's slightly different. And then, of course, the recommendation, at least for the self-employed, is calling, if you don't cover them mandatory, cover them in a voluntary way. It's amazing. We did some mapping, and these are different types of voluntary systems, opt-in or opt-out. So you have different kinds. This is in case workers or self-employed are not mandatory covered. Some systems give a voluntary opt-in. Here they only do if you reach the income threshold. Here they only do it if you reach the income you can go out and so on. So you have all kinds of different voluntary insurances. It's amazing, and it's very hard to say very standard things about it, except for some major things. I think in the recommendation it's also referred, and it's also my personal belief, voluntary coverage is fine. It's better than nothing. But it's not very practical, it's rather marginal as a kind of policy approach. Social Security needs, as a standard approach, obligation, mandatory protection, because you have high degrees of solidarity. And what we find, and it's not me, it's a colleague, Corignoni, he did some preparatory work for the recommendation as well, and he found out, and it's, in a way, it was confirming what was already known to some extent, that if you only give voluntary protection, for instance, to the self-employed or to all workers, that high income groups and low income groups don't take it up. And those you need in Social Security. Low income to protect, high income to finance. And both of them drop out. So you miss out on the ones who really needed the protection, and you miss out on the ones who really have to support it. And of course, your high income should also have an interest in the system by having nice benefits, but that's another story. Secondly, he found out that in reality, the voluntary schemes present for non-standard workers and self-employed, it was very, very low take-up. Majority does not take the voluntary insurance. If you give them the choice, they don't take it up. Hence, the Commission is very much in advising work with opt-out, so mandatory unless you really want to get out. Yes, but still. The result is low take-up, that at the end of the day, especially here, these groups, possibly also these, they will end up in social assistance. So the reflection that if they don't take up, okay, it's their decision, but then we don't have a problem with them, it's not true. They will come back, not in your social protection, but in your social assistance schemes. So to protect your social assistance schemes, you should have good social protection, and by preference mandatory social protection. And then there is another issue, risk of fragmentation. We have more and more working people who combine several jobs together over time or at the same time. If for one job you're protected and the other one you're not protected, you're mixing up you're making your protection very complicated. The mobility is having problems to mobility, go from one job to another job. And hence it's better to have mandatory protection, the same for everybody. It's more easy than to shift from one job to another job over time and also simultaneously. So in the text you may read from my hand, you will see that I am favoring strongly the mandatory approach, even though the recommendation is saying for the self-employed voluntarily, I'd interpret it very narrowly. This, of course, can have a place for luxurious things and for risks which are very difficult to organize, but you should not use it as a standard. Effective coverage is something else. It's Article 9. I will not go through the whole article, but probably you already see here qualifying periods, minimum work periods, and so on. It is about entitlement conditions and duration very often. You're in the scope, you are protected. As a worker, even a non-standard worker or self-employed, you are in the scope. You belong to them, and you pay your contributions and so on. However, you're bumping into other conditions, entitlement conditions. You bump into a qualifying period or a minimum working period. For instance, minimum working period, to be entitled for an unemployment benefit, you should show that you have been working at least so many days. And you did not work them because you only worked part-time and your days were counted part-time, of course. So you bump into that threshold. Qualifying period. To get a sickness benefit, you should show that you're insured for at least 6 months. But you're only insured 3 months. Because, for instance, you worked 2 weeks there, then you did not work for a month, and then you work 1 day there, and then you did not work for a week, and you don't come to those 6 months. Or the waiting periods is another example. I'm sick, but I have to wait 1 day or 2 days, the carence days, before they will give me the benefit. Or the calculation rules, my pension is lower because I only worked part-time. And they cut my pension because compared to a full-time equivalent, I only work part-time. It's about those rules. And those rules, of course, they hit much more strongly non-standard workers, part-time workers, workers on defined contracts than standard workers or full-time workers. Why these rules have been launched? Why did we do so? They had reasons. They had reasons. Very often to combat fraudulent behaviors. The sense that I hire you, but I know that I will fire you soon, but then at least you have a benefit. So I hire you for 2 days, then I fire you, but I know, and so you make an agreement, hire me, and then you can fire me, but then at least I have a benefit. No, hence qualifying periods, hence minimum working records. So they have a purpose, they have a cause, those rules. But the problem is they hit much more strongly non-standard work. And the recent employment survey of the Commission showed that if you look at the short-term unemployed, that overall only 1/3 of all working people was covered, so 2/3 not, and often it had to do with self-employed or these things hitting non-standard work. So formal coverage is about belonging to the personal scope, effective coverage is about entitlement criteria, and non-standard work face serious problems with that. So it's about minimum qualifying periods, minimum work records, waiting periods, and so on and so forth, very often to combat fraud or to show the insurance ID. We are very often dealing here with social insurances. Well, you know also from private insurances that normally you have to spend a longer period within the group before we give you a benefit. You should belong to the circle of solidarity long enough before we give you a benefit. And this is very much inspired by those rules. Where do we find them? We find them mainly in sickness, invalidity, maternity, unemployment, and old age and survivorship. Here very often minimum qualifying periods and waiting periods. Here also minimum work records. Here qualifying records. You should have been insured for the pension at least for 10 years or 15 years before we open entitlement. Also for the duration. So the longer you were part, the longer we will pay you. Very much present here and here. Healthcare and accident at work, you will not find them very often. And as I already said, traditionally designed for standard workers, but especially non-standard workers are seriously hit by it. Why? I think it's quite clear. To reach the full-time equivalence of the time you need or the income you need to open the entitlement, non-standard workers need more time. To say it very simply, in some systems, if you have to work at least 6 months full-time to open entitlement, and you work half-time, well, you need 12 months. I mean, that's as simple as that. And sometimes you don't even come to the desired duration. If, for instance, some systems say we only take into account your month of work if you can show that you have been working at least, let's say, 15 full-time days. And if you don't reach those 15 full-time days in that month, you lose your month. So it's about that. I think that's quite clear. For self-employed, it's a bit different. It's a bit repeating the story I said before. Very often longer waiting periods because sickness and unemployment is very difficult to organize for those people. We really have to be sure that you are not fraudulent, that you're long enough unemployed before we give you a benefit, or that you're long enough sick before we really are sure that you lose income. Hence, we lose longer waiting periods for those people because these are very difficult. So this has to do more with the risk very often. This has to do more with the part-time or the limited time elements. So it's slightly different for those two groups. Now, what does the recommendation say? First of all, let us be very clear, it is still allowed to use those thresholds. You can do it, the waiting periods and the minimum qualifying periods, you can do it. But you have to do it in a neutral way, and in a way it will not hit more severely non-standard work. So it means, first of all, there should be an objective, like combating fraudulent behavior. And then if you then look at non-standard work and self-employment, you have to do two things. If you have the same rules applying, check upon undesired effects for the non-standard workers, and I will give an example later on. If you have different rules for the self-employed and the standard workers, for instance, well, check whether you have an objective and you're not too far reaching in the proportionality. Well, to give an example, if the same rules apply, if you say 6 months of full-time work, well, it will hit more severely part-time workers. So maybe instead of saying 6 months, you can say so many hours of work or so many days. It's more easy for a non-standard worker to reach those hours or those days, especially if the reference period is longer. And that's what some countries did, like in Belgium, in the Dutch unemployment scheme. They have been redefining their insurance records instead of years of work or months of work, in days of work and hours of work, in longer reference periods, so it's much more easy for non-standard workers to reach those limits and to open entitlement to benefits. Or when you're having several jobs next to each other, I mean in Denmark and in Ireland for the unemployment, it's a recent change in Ireland, but also in France and in Bulgaria, they have been integrating those accounts of those different jobs and they merge them to some extent or aggregate them, so it's much more easy to reach those thresholds from all the little days of work from your different occupations and different jobs. So these are examples where the same rules have been retranslated, having the same effect, having the same objective, but it's more easy for non-standard workers to reach them. Another example, I simply will take this one. It are two cases of the European Court on non-discrimination. I will not deal with non-discrimination, but there were also some interesting paragraphs on non-standard work and effective protection. And in the past unemployment scheme in Spain, they had some issues with part-time workers for whom it was much more difficult to reach the thresholds, and it was being blamed that the way they designed their threshold was not very appropriate or effective. To say differently, there was no problem to have the minimum threshold for unemployment, to show that you should have a number of working days before you can open the benefit. But it was not done in a very coherent way. For instance, you had people working vertically part-time, meaning on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So they were working, or on Friday half a day, so 2 days and a half. And then you had people working horizontal. So they were working Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday and Friday, but only half-time, half a day. They are comparable. Both of them work 2 days and a half, but here vertical and here horizontal. Well, the ones working vertical, this was only counting for maximum 3 days. This was counting for 5 days, because every day there was a little bit of work. Here there was only on 3 days work, be it full-time, but it was only on 3 days. So they were hit more severely than here. This was strange. I mean, why making a difference for unemployment? For the financing, they noticed that the aggregate was taken for the calculation of the contributions to pay to the unemployment. So they were looking how many hours you worked a month, and then it was taken together for the calculation. But for the benefits, They simply looked how many days you were working, and then they set it off against a full-time equivalent, meaning that the duration became shorter. And there the court said this is not fair. The income is lower, so they will have already a lower benefit. And on top of that, you sanction them because proportionally you give less benefit because they did not come to a full-time equivalent. So this has to be revised. The same for the pension. So although the objective was fair and the idea was fair, they asked to have a more appropriate approach and to take more into account the situation of the non-standard workers. Sometimes it's allowed for your non-standard worker self-employed to have different rules if you can make your case. For instance, in Poland, they have longer waiting periods for the self-employed for sickness and unemployment. And they say, yeah, we have to do it because we really want to be sure that there's a loss of income. And they are not to be blamed themselves for unemployment. And therefore, we need that longer period of waiting. If we already give after 2 days a benefit, we never can be sure whether they lost income. Well, that could be a case. That could be a justification. The wage earners don't have it. The self-employed have it, as long as it is proportional. So those things can be done. Or you can, like in Belgium, make combinations of income and then sending somebody to help you in your business when you're as a self-employed sick. That can also be different rules, but at the end of the day, the protection is even equal here. So these can be outcomes. So it's possible to have those rules as long as you can justify them. If you have the same rules for everybody, check whether there is no undesired effect for the non-standard worker and the self-employed. If you have different rules, make your case. And that's a bit what the recommendation is saying. Adequacy, it's, again, I will not go into all the details. The interesting about adequacy is that it's saying make sure that you have high enough benefits so that people can maintain their standard of living. In social protection, you have 2 major goals. It's combating poverty, or social security, it's combating poverty, and it's to make sure that when you're hit by a risk, that at least in the short term, the first period, and if possible in the longer period, you can maintain your standard of living. And that's a bit what is being said here. So people hit by a risk, whatever their way of working, make sure that they can maintain their standard of living, but also make sure that they never fall into poverty. And you can take your whole system as a whole. You can also look at social assistance and healthcare benefits for elderly and so on, to compensate maybe for a lower pension, but if you have good healthcare and care protection, that could compensate. This is more about paying as you can. All workers should pay in relation to their capacity. So if you have high income, you should pay much. If you have low income, you can accept that you pay less. And it's possible to give some exemptions to people who really suffer. I mean, now with Corona, it was a very nice example. Some self-employed, they saw their income plummeting, then you can give exemptions, for instance. So sometimes people face hard times, then you can give exemptions or reduction in social contribution. And 14 is much more about the specific case of the self-employed. Make sure that when you make the levy of the contributions, that it's reflecting the reality. Or to say differently, what is income for a self-employed? It's one of the most difficult chapters in the financing, but try to come as close as possible to the reality. Now, what does it say? Well, the first thing maybe I would like to mention is this chapter on adequacy is more than only good level of protection. It's about adequacy and financing, because it's asking to look at the capacity of when you finance, and it's also asking the self-employed to make sure that you reach their reality, what is income, that you come as closely as possible to their real income. It's also about the interrelation between financing and benefits. If you read very carefully the recommendation, there are some logics of proportionality and equivalence saying that if you pay much into the system, well, then probably you will have a higher benefit standard of living. If you pay very little into the system, you cannot expect to get very high benefits. That would be very strange. Of course, there is redistribution, that people who were not able to pay much sometimes will get a higher benefit, and people who paid in much possibly will get a lower benefit, because we need redistribution, that's true. But still you have to respect a little bit the equivalence. It cannot be possible that people who have been paying very, very, very little to the system, that they get very high benefits. That would be very strange. So that relation is also being addressed. And then, of course, it's addressing what is an adequate level and how to make sure that people pay adequately into the system and how is that interrelation. Now, one of the weaknesses, I think, of this recommendation was that, or that was very often criticized by the outside world when it was launched, was it's not saying clearly what is the level, the desired level. It's not saying the pension should be of that level, or the pension should be at least 60% of the average income, or the pension should be 70% of what you earned before. It's not saying that. That's true. That's true. So that's missing. I mean, this is a scheme from the ILO, for instance, in the code. There you see that relation. So a standard beneficiary, one working man with a wife not working and 2 children, when that person is taken ill, the benefit should be at least 45% of his previous average earnings. Here it's being very clearly said what it is. In case you have a full-time career, of course, and it's in relation to your income. The EU does not have that. They have other things. They refer to the poverty level, for instance, so that they're much more familiar with poverty, that your poverty level, that people should not drop below the 60% of the median average disposable income. But this recommendation is not about poverty. So it's a kind of little bit of black hole now for the moment. What are the desired levels? It's not clear. It's not spoken out. Should we look at this, or is it something else? What we know is it should not go below poverty. That we know. Okay. But what is it then? That we have to see in the monitoring, I think, in the future months, how they will. My guess and my hope is that with the data they have available, and they already have quite some measurement tools in the recommendation and in the monitoring of the systems in the EU, and with the existing ones of the ILO, that they will come to a coherent approach and have them put together. So that will be an outcome. This is not the EU recommendation, let us be very clear, but the pillar and the EU recommendation say that we should respect those things as well. But how to respect them and integrate them, that will be an issue for the future. What it does say, though, is that you should, I think that's more important, and I will say it again, here you should make sure that you guarantee a decent standard of living, and that should be of different level than the poverty level. But how that will cohabit, we will have to see in the future. Okay, so what does it address? I will run over some of the issues. The more technical one, the financing for the self-employed. What are the issues here? What are the problems? Well, the self-employed, first of all, they declare their own income. What is the problem? The problem of possible under-reporting. And of course, this is a challenge for Article 12 because it's asking to pay in relation to the capacity. But if you don't know the capacity, if people under-report, if it's in the hidden economy, you don't know who is really weak and who is not weak. So that's quite a challenge. Another challenge is that income of self-employed fluctuates. 1 year it's very big, 1 year it's very low. If you have to organize the levy of the contributions, you can only organize this on the basis of the existing income, but you don't know the full income of the year. You have to wait another 2 years. So that complicates very much the system. So you give provisional payments, and then you have to wait 2 years before you have the final payments. That can blur a bit the picture and make it complicated. And then what is income of the self-employed? That's also quite an issue. Is it only the income out of the work, but can it also be income out of the capital of your business? That's an open question. So you have to pay in relation to your capacity, but what is the capacity? What is income? It's not always clear. I will not go too much into detail. I will give some examples trying to address some issues with the self-employed. Very recently in Estonia, they launched an entrepreneur account. That's for freelancers, solo self-employed people. Not in the most sophisticated way. They don't have a lot of costs, and they don't have a kind of cost structure, so they don't need a cost to have it deducted from their taxes. So in that way, their income is quite easily perceived. So they don't need a bookkeeper or whatever to have it declared. And hence Estonia launched with banks who have interest, and so far I think there is one bank, to open an entrepreneur account. And if money comes on the account, immediately a certain percentage is being deducted for Social Security, and that's it. So it's a very low threshold, very simple approach, and people may be much more tempted to launch that entrepreneur account to be fully in line with social protection. Otherwise, they had to go through that very difficult approach and difficult calculations, going to maybe an accountant or a bookkeeper, and then possibly they may have decided not to join the system and to continue to moonlight and to work in the hidden economy. This is lowering the threshold to put you in line with the formalities. It comes very close to the Latin American system of the monotributo, where you have unified tax and social security, low thresholds, easy, so the threshold is very low, and so on. This is more about the Künstler Sozialabgabe. It's for artists, freelance artists, where the commissioner, the one buying the art, is paying also a contribution. So the artist is paying a contribution to the system, but the one who is purchasing the art is also paying a contribution to the system through an in-between institution. So there you have a kind of employer contribution. So the idea would be that the ones buying services and goods from self-employed, for instance, would also pay a contribution on what they buy. So those are simply ideas which may address it. Then what the recommendation is also asking, I think it's also interesting, if you have then low-income groups like self-employed with financial problems, and they have on a temporary basis some problems, you can exempt them. And it's calling them, do something that they don't collapse. And I think the COVID period was a very nice period. Well, in that way, it was a nice period to see that many of the member states arranged all kinds of things, making it possible for self-employed that they could postpone their contribution or exempt their contributions, sometimes with loss of protection, but with the possibility then, if things go better, to retroactively funding their lost period. From Latin America, for instance, you see other examples, especially for the solo self-employed or the freelancers in a very close to the informal sector, that if they don't have the possibility to pay their contributions because of financial problems, that sometimes they get upfront guarantee. So the system pays them so that they can pay their contributions. And the idea is it's better to keep them into the system of social protection than pushing them out, because then they will end up in social assistance and they may cost us more. So here there are some tools which exist and which also address very much that issue of the recommendation. If the capacity is low at a certain moment, well, you have to address it. What if your capacity is continuously low? If you have an activity which continuously brings low income, then we come into another kind of story, of course, and that's a more difficult one. Can we accept that people pay contributions, low contributions, or are exempted from paying contributions because they have a very low income? Because if you look at, they earn only half of the minimum subsistence. So they work, they earn half of the minimum subsistence, and we exempt them from paying, but we give them full protection. Is that possible? Well, I think it is possible, but you have to very clearly speak out in which situations do we think it's desirable. For instance, it can be desirable for people who do useful activities for society at large, and then you will have to define it. But it's not temporary, it's structural. If you grant it as a kind of standard, then you're doing strange things. You may exempt people from paying contributions, making for them it possible to do their work at a very cheap rate, and hence they will come into competition with other professional earners. To give you one example, what is very fashionable now is that people sometimes have a side self-employed activity. So they're a wage earner, and next to that they also have a little business. And then we say we exempt them from paying from that little business because they are already protected as wage earners. Well, by doing that, it sounds logical. They are already protected, so why bothering in having them paid as well in that self-employed activity? Yes, but there are two downsides. The first one is this is falsifying the competition, because if in my spare time I'm gardening to my neighbors their gardens. I'm coming in competition with a professional gardener and I'm taking away his clients because I'm much cheaper, because I don't have to pay contributions, because it's only my side activity. That was, by the way, also one of the reasons why the Belgian court recently said that this rule was not the best rule you could have in our system. Secondly, you're losing out of potential contributions. I think it's a more sound approach that you say you also have to contribute, and possibly it can help you to enlarge your benefit, and if not, it will help others to enlarge your benefit. I think this is addressing the temporary, but the structural one, you have to think very clearly, what do you want? And I think you have to be very careful. Good, and then you have some I will go much quicker there, from non-standard workers. Financing, you have the danger of splitting up your contributions. If I combine 5 little jobs with 5 different employers, maybe 1 self-employed, 3 employers, you may end up in different schemes, and every time again, with that little job, do not reach a threshold to be taken up into the system. So you have a danger of splitting up the contribution. So the recommendation is then asking, try to merge those activities and the income from those activities, that those schemes talk to each other so that at least you reach your threshold and you can enter. Major and side activity, I've been addressing it. Should we do something special for the side activity? Sounds, of course, popular and nice, but it has down effects, as I mentioned before. And let us be very frank. I mean, major and side, very often it's counted in number of hours of work. If I work enough hours, half time or more, or if I work 4/5 hours in major, then this is a side. But now, if majority of people is working at home, what are working hours? It's getting more and more under pressure, so it's not so clear anymore what is major and side activity. So apart from the other issues, there's also a technical issue. If you have many workers, many jobs, you will have many employers. Some of them will be even in platform economy like Amazon, Turk and others, they are overseas. How to organize the financing if you have many employers, like in agency work and so on. That's also a challenge. And this is much more related to much of the non-standard work that in the end of the day may end up in a situation where they are being hired because they're not protected, hence they are cheap, and hence you get a kind of social dumping. But you see some reactions, as you can see from the references here. There has been a commission, Boorslap, in the Netherlands addressing this. The posting getting more stringent, maybe it can become even more stringent. And then some case law who is cutting the very fictitious relations between an employer where the employee does not have any bounds except that he is being put into that system because it's very cheap, but for the rest he does not have contact with the employer. Can that be possible? No, the court said you have to look who is giving instructions in reality. So that's being addressed already, but you see that non-standard work and financing is very often also related to people being hired for their cheap labor force. I think I've been covering that. And then the last thing, it's transparency, transparent access. I think it sounds logical. There are, I think, 3 layers in it. One, to make sure that the system is very well informed to their citizens, make sure that you give enough information, and you can also use IT for that to make it more easy, that benefits are more easily provided to your beneficiaries. So that's about information and the use of information technology to make it transparent. But it's also about the design of your system, make it simple. I refer again to the Estonian case of the account. It's a simple design, and it's much more easy than to access your social protection rather than making a very complicated system to access, and then you need a bookkeeper or a kind of in-between to help you to figure out how you have to obey by the rules. Then that will push off some people because they don't have the time or the money to hire those specialized people to simply obey by the law. And so keep it simple as well. Apart from that, there is also an issue of transferability. If you have many jobs, make sure that those systems speak to each other. I mentioned that before. It's Article 10. I will not come back to that. Okay, then the largest part was the recommendation. 2 little things on access beyond the EU recommendation. platform workers, and maybe some standards in the field of financing. The recommendation was designed in a period when platform work was slowly coming up to the foreground. So we're talking about people like working for Deliveroo or Uber, but also Amazon Mechanical Turk. Even Lego has a kind of platform where you can put designs and you can pay for it and so on. And here we see that the way they work is very flexible. To show you that, I mean, most of the platform workers, they are either portfolio workers or crowd workers. Portfolio workers, they are designers, engineers, artists with a portfolio. It's put on the platform and they are being hired by companies because of their portfolio. They're very much impressed by their portfolio and they want to hire them, and it's in a very flexible and global way. Crowd work is very often differently. It's about people who are willing to do something. They don't have much to do, but they're willing to do so. And those people are hired through platforms, but they are in demand to find a job. So it's the other relation. Now, what we did once is to put non-standard work, to picture that. And these elements which are being colored, it shows those are elements of the standard workers which are being fulfilled. Now look at crowd workers. None of the traditional elements in the relation of standard work is being fulfilled, meaning they are extremely flexible and extremely weak, and very often they don't access enough social protection because they are so flexible that our social protection scheme is not up to it. To give a very simple example, many of those workers have a geographical mobility which is very high. They work for an employer who is located overseas through a computer or through an IT-driven basis, which is again put somewhere else. They provide services to a client who is hiring them through the platform, again in another country. Who is the employer in that situation? Already that question is so difficult to be addressed that in most situations social protection does not take them into account and is having quite some problems. Now, what is the major problem with those workers? They are very often and part-time and working fixed term and self-employed. So of all the typical atypical work forms, they have the characteristics of everything. And I think here you see it very clearly. The typical elements of standard work, they're completely absent here. And they are very, very, very flexible in their way of working, and hence it's very, very, very difficult to capture them in social protection. That has to do with geographical mobility. It also has to do with the little amount of work very often. So a platform is asking you to drive somebody from one place to another place. It's a gig, they call it a gig, and as from the music scene you know what it is. It's a little piece of work. And people, they fill their days with little piece of work, sometimes for different platforms or different workers. And we are not used to that in our social protection. We are used to full-time work. And those little gigs are too marginal, too little, and hence we face some problems. And sometimes people are not even aware that they are working. They have an account on Instagram, they get money for that, they get subsidies for sponsorship, and they don't feel as if they're earning money because of their Instagram account. I think it's fully for them. They don't consider that to be work and income out of work. That is challenging. That is not fully covered by the recommendation. The recommendation is also addressing that, but it's not fully. And I think there are some challenges. I think for those people, the emphasis in our social protection should be more upon income rather than on work. Sometimes they do not work very much. They work some hours, but earn a lot of income. But that doesn't matter in the end of the day for them. The money they get for their face, the money they get for their account, even if they're not fully working hours occupied by that, doesn't matter. But that's income. On that income they live, and that income should be protected. And I think systems which focus far too much upon work will have problems with those platform workers. And I think we will have a shift in our social protection systems. We have to think about it. And also geographical mobility. I think almost by definition, Europe will have to play a role here. You cannot limit it to the national boundaries. So here you feel that the recommendation it does not address, it does not contradict it either, but there are some additional elements, additional challenges for precarious work and access to social protection, and you can even ask whether wage ownership and self-employment can be still different. Access on financing. If you look at the pillars and also the recommendation, it's mainly focusing upon benefits. It does address financing too, but it's mainly benefits. And that's an open question on the story of the European Union. Is it possible to have a European Union not giving clear indications to its member states on the minimum they have to invest in social protection, so the minimum contribution, and possibly the maximum contribution? And I think more and more this financing is left untouched, and I think the European Union in the longer term will have to reflect, maybe we have to launch a fork, a bandwidth, if to impose that upon member states, that at least the contribution should be of that level, then at least we know that's being invested, and possibly maximum it should be of that level, that there is a bandwidth. And then the states can decide themselves how much they will invest, and then we can monitor the benefits. That's an open question. It's simply to say that we focus here far too much upon benefits and we lose a little bit side of the financing. The financing is important for equal opportunities, for fair competition. We cannot have a fair competition on the EU internal market without addressing this, but that's a bit, of course, a bit more out of reach of today. So when we look at precarious work, we should make sure that new work forms are not left without protection, and that we, at the same time, when we organize protection for those new work forms, that they incorporate the specificities of that work. I think that's the main message from my talk today and from the recommendation as well. So, secondly, we should also make sure that when we deal with precarious work, it should not become less precarious. I think we should have a look broader than work. We should also have a look at income. There is a whole evolution taking place. People earn their income also on the basis of other activities than simply work activities. And hence we should give a little bit of more breathing space to our systems. So that was a bit it for this afternoon, for today. Thank you very much for your attention and hope to see you soon in real life, in a real life situation. Thank you.